The health and safety of all learners and colleagues must be of prime concern to employers, head teachers, governors and design and technology colleagues. It is well recognised that the D&T environment is potentially one of the most dangerous within a learner's experience. Our aim must be to provide a safe and healthy environment for all, and to promote correct attitudes and behaviour towards safety. The Health and Safety at Work Act was instrumental in setting the framework for health and safety in schools. This Act applies to all educational establishments and imposes upon all concerned a clear obligation to take responsibility for the health and safety of themselves and others. Anyone who does not have regard to or exercise reasonable care for health and safety is committing a legal offence. Under this Act, regulations were approved to meet specific requirements of the law. Why then should we carry out risk assessment? Well, in the first place, the law tells us we have to. There is nothing new about this. Risk assessment has been an implicit duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act since 1974. But current health and safety legislation now makes risk assessment an explicit duty. The management of health and safety at work regulations require that employers carry out an assessment of risks to the health and safety of employees and other persons. But of course the most compelling reason for risk assessment is to prevent accidents, injuries and illnesses. Sensible risk management is about taking practical steps to protect colleagues and learners from harm, not bureaucratic back-covering. The law does not expect that you will eliminate all risk, but colleagues and learners should be protected as far as is reasonably practicable. When new equipment and methods are introduced, for example, colleagues must be aware of new potential hazards and should review all aspects of health and safety before presenting work to learners. Undertaking risk assessment should not involve departments in producing excessive paperwork. Rather, it should be a practical exercise that makes a difference. The Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations notes that there are no fixed rules about how a risk assessment should be carried out. A risk assessment is simply a careful examination of what in your work could cause harm to people, so that you can weigh up whether you have taken enough precautions or should do more to prevent harm. In this first presentation, we're going to look at developing our understanding of the process of risk assessment. Let's start by doing a bit of homework and looking at the advice provided by the Health and Safety Executive. Their leaflet, 5 Steps to Risk Assessment, defines what an assessment should consist of. We know then that risk assessment is an examination of what in your work could cause harm to people. Workers and others have a right to be protected from harm caused by a failure to take reasonable control measures. How then can you assess the risks in your workplace? All risk assessments should follow the 5 steps to risk assessment, and step 1 is to identify the hazards. Step 2 is to decide who might be harmed and how they might be harmed. Step 3 is to evaluate the risks and to decide on precautions that are going to be taken. Step 4 is to record your findings and to implement them. And finally, step 5 is to review your assessment and to update it if necessary. Risk assessments must be carried out by competent people, those who know what to look for. It is the employer's responsibility to ensure that those carrying out the work are competent. All staff in the department should be involved in the process. They will have useful information about how the work is done that will make the assessment of the risk more thorough and effective. When thinking about risk assessment, remember, a hazard is anything that may cause harm, such as chemicals, electricity, lifting, working from ladders. The risk is the chance, high or low, that somebody could be harmed by these and other hazards, together with an indication of how serious the harm could be. Step 1 is to identify the hazards. First, you need to work out how people could be harmed. Recognition is through observation, questioning, evaluation, and systematic inspection and checking. You need to check manufacturers' instructions for equipment or data sheets for substances. Remember to think also about long-term hazards to health, for example, high levels of noise or exposure to harmful substances, as well as safety hazards. Is the environment suitable? Is there sufficient space? Does the activity involve lifting? Step 2 is to decide who might be harmed and how. For each hazard, you need to be clear about who might be harmed. This may include not just learners and colleagues working within design and technology, but also teaching assistants, cleaners, and visitors to the department. In each case, you need to identify how they might be harmed, for example, what type of injury might occur. Step 3 is to evaluate the risks and decide on precautions. Having identified the hazards, you need to decide what to do about them. Risk assessment is an assessment of the likelihood that the hazard may cause hurt and/or damage. The action to be taken in order to dissipate and/or control the hazard needs to be clearly identified. You can work this out for yourself, but the best way is to compare what you are doing with good practice. The adoption and adaptation of model risk assessments is the preferred method for doing this. You need to consider first, though, if you can get rid of the hazard altogether. If not, how can you control the risks so that harm is unlikely? Risk control measures can be engineering control measures or procedural measures such as systems of work in conjunction with instruction and supervision, and personal protective equipment. Consider too individual capability. Does use of the equipment require special information or training? Step 4 is to record your findings and implement them. Significant findings must be recorded. The Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations notes that a suitable and sufficient risk assessment should be made. The level of detail in a risk assessment should be proportionate to the risk. You need to be able to demonstrate that a proper check was made of the activity, you considered who might be affected, you dealt with all the significant hazards, taking into account all of the people who could be involved, the risk control measures you have identified are reasonable, and the remaining risk is low, and finally that you involved relevant staff in the process. Step 5 is to review your assessment and update it if necessary. An assessment is not a piece of paper you fill in and then just forget about. You need to review what you are doing, and risk assessment should be formally reviewed on a regular basis, for example at least annually, as new schemes of work are introduced and new groups are formed. Workplaces do not stay the same. New equipment and machinery, substances and procedures can all introduce new hazards and will require new risk assessments to be prepared. Do you need to introduce changes to working practices? Are there new people working in the department? Are there improvements that can be made? Have you learnt anything from accidents or near misses? Have there been any complaints? In situations where groups of people are doing the same job, then a model assessment can be made. One assessment can be applied to the whole group. The management regulations note that employers who control a number of similar workplaces containing similar activities may produce a model risk assessment reflecting the core hazards and risks associated with these activities. Such model assessments may be employed by employers or managers at each workplace, but only if they A. satisfy themselves that the model assessment is appropriate to their type of work, and B. adapt the model to the detail of their own actual work situations, including any extension necessary to cover hazards and risks not referred to in the model. Both the British Standard 4163/2007 and the CLEAPS Model Risk Assessments can be used by employers and employees to provide model risk assessments. The second half of this presentation illustrates how we can adopt and adapt model risk assessments in practice to meet the requirements of the management regulations. It's important to note, though, that mere possession of these published texts does not meet the regulations which call for risk assessments to be made. They are starting points which you need to adopt and adapt to suit the circumstances in which the activities in your department are being undertaken.